Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. This is part 2 of our special 2-part series with Amy Chua from the Yale Law School. Amy, again, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So in part 1, we've been talking about tribalism, the drawing of maps, what people do and can't do, as it were, what we want them to do. Let's talk about what you wrote in regard to specific countries, and that really fascinated me. Let's start with Vietnam. And how little, and I think kind of the rubric of all this is the fact that American policymakers deploying hundreds of thousands of troops, literally trillions of dollars of resources, costing us tens of thousands of lives, totally failed to even understand the dynamics of multiple countries that we have been involved with. And that, to me, I mean, that revelation really comes out for anyone reading your book. And that's just kind of stunning to me that we keep repeating the same mistakes. So talk about the concept, the mistakes we're making, and in particular, talk about Vietnam.
Yes, we always, we tend to see things in terms of these great ideological battles. In the case of the Cold War, it was communism versus capitalism. So we went into Vietnam thinking we are going to get rid of this terrible communist specter, you know, the domino theory. And
right, and the domino theory was the
if
idea
Vietnam
that
falls, all of it might go communist, and paying very little attention to the sort of specific cultural context, the national context. So by now, Vietnam is my favorite case because a lot of people are fascinated by, people think that they know a little bit about Vietnam. It's pretty common knowledge now that we underestimated the role of nationalism. That is how much Ho Chi Minh, that is the president of the North Vietnam communists, was actually not necessarily fighting for Marxism, but really for independence, right? They had, Vietnam had been colonized for 1,000 years, first by the Chinese and later by the French. So the reason he was so popular wasn't because of Leninist theory. These poor peasants didn't know anything about that theory. They wanted their freedom. And we made a huge mistake. We, in the United States, assumed that Vietnam was a pawn of China. You know, and I think a lot of that is, I hate this term because it's overused, racism. You know, it's like, Vietnamese, Chinese, Koreans, they're all kind of the same. And it's fascinating. In the late 90s, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, met his former counterpart. It was very touching. Interviews, you know, the Minister of Defense of North Vietnam, former enemies. And at a certain point, the Vietnamese minister says, Secretary McNamara, you must never have read a history book. Because if you'd had, you'd know that we, Vietnam, couldn't have been pawns of the Chinese. We have been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years, and we would fight the last man, no matter what the U.S. did. So that was the first mistake. We didn't see that, we could have played China possibly off against Vietnam. But there was a second difference, and here's what most people, even experts, don't know about Vietnam. Vietnam had within its borders what I call a market-dominant minority. That is, for hundreds of years, there was a tiny 1% ethnic Chinese minority inside Vietnam, only 1% of the population, and yet this tiny Chinese minority controlled about 80% of the commerce, of the industry, of the rice business, of petrol, everything. They were the middlemen. They were the people dealing with the French. So the U.S. missed this. So we come in, we're like, we're going to bring in capitalism, not even realizing that or the vast majority of Vietnam's capitalists were not even Vietnamese. They were part of this ethnic Chinese outsider group. So right from the get-go, we really doomed ourselves in that battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people.
We were helping the people that the Vietnamese people most resented.
And not only that, the little Chinese minority, they were very insular. They lived with themselves, they intermarried amongst themselves, spoke their own language.
They were tribal.
They were tribal and did not even fight in the Vietnam War. So we're basically, we didn't know this, and we come in and we're essentially asking the Vietnamese people to fight and to see their sons and fathers die to keep in power and keep rich this little hated minority, and so it was really, and that is something, so I'm of the generation, we used to hear about Vietnamese boat people, in 1979 and 80s. What's really interesting is that 85% of those so-called Vietnamese boat people in 1979, 85% were actually ethnic Chinese. But they didn't admit it, or maybe even didn't tell their children, because there was ethnic cleansing going on in Vietnam. And this is a piece of
That's
the,
after we left.
after we left. We just washed our hands of it. But after we left, there were these ethnic cleansing programs where the majority Vietnamese either sent the ethnic Chinese, they confiscated all their property, they were the rich people, sent them to the countryside, or expelled them. And that's where a lot of them died. And this piece of the Vietnam War, even with the wonderful Burns documentary, actually doesn't come out. And it does come out in French sources. It's not that no scholars have ever written about it, but not American scholars. We are very blind to these ethnic differences.
How about, well, it's interesting because when you look at the list of military operations in countries that, in which we've been involved, repeating this same mistake over and over again. And I want to talk about some of the other countries. But first, why do we have such a problem learning from our mistakes?
I'm hoping that my book will help. And I've been invited to a lot of fabulous institutions. I spoke at the Brookings Institute, the Carnegie Endowment, and thank you for having me on your show. I have had incredibly great response from people in the State Department. And so I explained in the book that part of the reason we're so blind is something good about America. That is, we actually have had, compared to every other superpower, the most success in assimilating all kinds of different people of different ethnicities: Irish, Italian, Japanese, Korean. They're all assimilated after, it's not perfect. The history of Native Americans and African Americans is very different, very dark. Nevertheless, we tend to think, oh, let's just bring democracy and markets to people, and that will go away. So in Afghanistan, another interesting case, we went in there right after 9/11. Hearts were broken. It was a wave of collective anger and grief. We went in thinking, just myopically, we got to root out these terrorists. What's amazing in Afghanistan, and I don't know if a lot of Americans know even today, but they didn't realize, we didn't really focus on the fact that the Taliban is not just a fundamentalist religious movement, which of course it is, it's also an ethnic movement. Afghanistan, like a lot of developing countries, is incredibly complex ethnically, tribally. So many different ethnicities, like 16 or 14 of them mentioned in the Constitution. But the Taliban is actually an ethnic Pashtun movement. The Pashtuns are the largest ethnic group there. And the Taliban actually arose out of this fear of the Pashtuns that they were going to be sidelined, that these competing ethnic groups, the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, were going to take over. We were so blind when we went in there. We had this huge military victory. Initially, we sent the Taliban running to the caves. But why are they back now? Because we aligned ourselves with exactly the groups that the Pashtuns hate and resent and fear most, the Uzbeks and the Tajiks. And again, I talked to policymakers and they agree. They're like, we did not pay enough attention to those differences. It's our perspective is, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Pashtuns, they look all kinds of the same, and not at all. And that's something we really just have to get right.
So what are the prospects for Afghanistan, whose government is very fragile? Prior to his ascension, I had Ashraf Ghani on
Yes.
the show.
Well, what a lot of people are seeing now, and this is what I say in the book, we have brilliant people doing our policy, foreign policy. The problem is we always are coming from behind after we make the egregious mistakes. We essentially, I write in the book, even going back to the late 70s, we actually armed and funded the rise of the Taliban, right? So
Sure, because we were helping them fight the Russians.
Exactly. Again, but totally blind to the fact of we got played by Pakistan. So what I think needs to happen is we need to start paying attention to these group and tribal and ethnic and sectarian differences at the beginning, right when we're going in. as to what's going to happen now, I mean, I think everyone agrees that we're not going to be able to solve the Afghanistan problem unless you solve this Pashtun problem. They are the largest ethnic group. So the term Pashtun is often viewed as synonymous with Afghan. You know, the Pashtuns think that Afghanistan is their country. Pashtuns founded Afghanistan, and most of them, for most of its history, Pashtuns ruled it. And unfortunately, there are 14 other ethnic groups. So something has to be done to work this out. And I cannot give an answer right now, one thing. But the first starting point is to understand these ethnic and tribal dynamics, how important. People will do anything for their tribes. If you can get certain tribal leaders to go along, the people will follow. So that has to be the mindset, not just, you know what, we're going to root out this whole group and they're all just terrorists. That's not going to work.
All right, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back with Amy in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today.
The Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. Remember, this is part 2 of our special 2-part series, so make sure you watch part 1. Okay, Amy, is racism a function of tribalism?
Well, it's certainly a version of tribalism. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But this is an overused term. I don't know. I think this term is like part of what's happening that's so terrible in America. It is so overused now. I teach on a college campus. If somebody prepares sushi in an inappropriate way, that's racist. I mean, if everything becomes racist, then nothing is. So and by the way, it's part of human nature. The studies I show in the book, as of 3 months, Chinese babies prefer seeing Chinese mothers' faces. White babies prefer seeing white mothers' faces. Ethiopian babies prefer seeing Ethiopian, faces. So that's kind of tricky because I often say with immigration that imagine if a country, say Ghana, discovered that in 20 years it was going to become a majority white. How do you think the Ghanaians would respond? They would be anxious, right? Now, is that racist? It's sort of human nature to identify with your group. And that's why I think our immigration debate needs to get better. We can't just be flinging these terms around. Xenophobic, misogynist, bigot. We're getting absolutely nowhere in our dialogue.
So how do we change that dialogue?
Well, it's a little bit like what I said I try to do at a micro level with my students. I think people on both sides, we're literally not having a national conversation. So let's take progressives, the group that I know best. I think that instead of, if somebody says, I'm a little bit worried about immigrants from the Middle East or Latin America, instead of just saying, you are a racist homophobe, we can't talk to you, racist xenophobe, have a conversation. Have a discussion, because we really need to have this. Like, what are our rules going to be? And we're not going to all agree. We're at the point right now where it's almost like we view people on the other side of the political spectrum, not just as people we disagree with and want to debate and want to be angry at. It's almost like we view people who voted on the other side as immoral, as evil, enemies. And when you start to see the other side as actually un-American, that is super dangerous. Again, if you look at the global context, that's what leads people to have civil war. Like, we need to get our country back, and that's very unhealthy.
All right, I want to jump into a couple things. One is, how do you think globalization has affected tribalism?
Globalization, first of all, is not class neutral. Globalization is not race neutral. So globalization means a lot of things, but let's talk about global markets. Obviously, some people have benefited much more, and that's often these big urban centers, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and a lot of people in southern areas, rural areas, inland areas have not. And that has, of course, led to a lot of people saying, wait a minute, this is not working for me, and I don't want to vote for the political party that is claiming that this universalist thing is benefiting all of us, because I can see that it's not. Right in my own neighborhood, I can see that it's not.
All right, what elements or aspects of democracy do you think are self-correcting?
Well, we are at an unprecedented moment right now. Two things are happening. First, for the first time in our history, whites are on the verge of losing their status as the majority. For 200 years, whites were economically and politically and culturally dominant. And the result of that lots of terrible things can happen, obviously slavery and, our treatment of the Native Americans. But when you have a group that's that comfortably dominant, they can also afford to be more generous. What's happened now is, with whites on the verge of losing their majority status, every group in America feels threatened. It's not just minorities who feel threatened. Whites feel threatened. You can see these studies that I cite, that I think it's 67% of working class whites now feel that they are subject to more discrimination and persecution than minorities. I see this with my students. Affirmative action is hurting us. We aren't getting these positions. And it's when people feel threatened that they retreat. They become more insular and more us versus them. It's not just our religious minorities, not just Muslims and Jews who feel threatened. Christians feel threatened now. So democracy in this context is not a panacea, right? We want to think that democracy, elections, is just going to cure things, but elections can often lead to demagoguery and scapegoating. And you see this. You see populist, semi-ethno-nationalist movements right now. You see, for the first time, almost openly white nationalist lingo. Now that's overblown. I think it's ridiculous to say that 60 million people, have white supremacist views. That's dialogue that is just completely counterproductive.
But at the same time, when you look at how to generate votes, certainly I think most social scientists say that motivating people by fear tops almost everything else.
And it's terrible. And you see that among all the different brackets. It's not just one racial or ethnic group, playing to the base. And what we need to remember, the most important part of my book, is that the United States, we have something incredibly special and rare. We are what I call a supergroup. And it's very sort of simple. What is a supergroup? Only two requirements need to be met. First, a supergroup is a country that has a very strong overarching national identity, American, right? The second requirement to be a supergroup is that you have to allow all these individual subgroup identities to flourish, sub-tribal identities. So at our best, we are a country where somebody can be, I'm Libyan American, I'm Mexican American, I'm Croatian American, Italian American, Irish American, and intensely patriotic at the same time. And that's actually very rare. If you think of a country like China or even France, they are not supergroups. They have the first thing, a very strong collective identity, but they don't allow, Uyghurs and Tibetans, or in France's case, Muslim populations to really, they can't even wear the head, their headscarf issues. So we need to remember who we are, what makes us special, and subgroup identities don't need to give those up, but we need to make sure that we start to remember what is it that gives us this collective identity. We have always had an ethnically and religiously, well, sorry, not always, but we have an ethnically and religiously neutral constitution. It has not been neutral in the way we've applied it. It's been shameful, the way we have repeatedly failed to live up to our expectations and our own principles. But I think if you go back to the principles and realize that America is an aspirational country, that we've never existed, the America that was supposed to be. But it's those principles rooted in the Constitution that we all share. We really do. But we can't just say, oh, we're already there. Stop, minority, stop complaining. We have to figure out a way to let marginalized communities feel that those principles do apply to them. Because if they don't feel it, if they see their people being, you see your own people being shot in the back without due process, or you feel slighted, you don't feel that you're getting afforded equal dignity, why would you believe that the Constitution's principles really ring true? So I end with Langston Hughes' poem, let America be America again. America is the country that never has been, and yet he says America must be, America will be. And I think that's what we all need to kind of elevate ourselves and try to reach that.
All right, well, we're going to talk about more of your optimism in a moment. We'll be back with our final segment with Amy. Stay tuned for more.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
The Rexall Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Rexall Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
Join me and watch The Aaron Harber Show.
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 I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch The Aaron Harber Show and keep hope alive.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment with Amy Chua. So make sure you watch part one. This is the ending segment for part two. So tell me about America's two white tribes.
So a lot of elites in America miss this. You know, we think of ourselves as very not tribal. We're cosmopolitan, universalists. But what's happening in America is not just that whites are on the verge of losing their majority status. There's a second thing going on that I think is equally important, and that is that class has essentially split America's white majority. Right now, there was so, roughly speaking, I'm talking about the whites on the coasts in Manhattan and LA, and also in Chicago and Boulder, those coastal elites, if you will.
I beg your pardon.
And the inland, more rural, working class whites that were President Trump's base. The interaction between these two white groups is so little now, and they're almost so acrimonious. Their values are so different that that divide is almost what the equivalent of what social scientists would call an ethnic divide. You know, there's very little intermarriage. It's much more likely somebody who attended Columbia would marry a Nigerian American or an Asian American of their same educational background than somebody from Appalachia.
All right, that's fascinating. I don't know if I agree with that, but we'll talk about that off camera or another show.
Yeah.
How about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and resolution of that part of the Middle East?
Oh my gosh,
You have 60 seconds to solve that tribal problem.
Honestly, and I'm going to let you down, that is not, you know that I write about Afghanistan and Libya, and I just never like talking about countries where I don't know the exact, so I'm not an expert on that one. But let's just say it's going to be complicated, and it obviously directly impacts the United States. I mean, that's part of the tribalism that's happening here. One thing that I lament is tribalism in our politics here makes everything almost like monolithic blocks. Like if you're on this team, if you are a good progressive, it's not like you could have different views about immigration and trade and Israel. It's like a slate. You have to have all these views. And I think that's unhealthy. I think people should have it's possible to have independent views on different issues. Not everybody has to be one way.
Absolutely. However, I am making a formal request for you to come up with a tribal-related solution to the Israeli-Palestinian compromise.
I'll work on it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. You didn't have to accept the challenge. Okay. Final question. We talked about this, and you referenced in terms of, we've talked about the sensitivity of people. We've talked about social media. Are we creating a world, basically a crybaby world, where everybody feels threatened, everybody feels offended, no one has the ability to take a hit, be a man, be a woman, put your big girl pants on or big boy pants on?
Well, you know that I wrote the Tiger Mother book. So yes, part of me thinks that we all, without finger pointing, need to elevate ourselves, right? I like to, first of all, part of the chaos and horrible feelings that we have, weirdly, I think are something healthy, right? Which is that for most of our history, we did have tribalism. It was just one very dominant tribe, this kind of white male tribe. So what we're seeing now is a lot of formerly silenced voices are finally expressing themselves. So that's not bad. But yes, having said that, I think that if we're ever going to have a conversation, we can't get from a 1 to 10 scale, we can't get past a half, right? Because somebody says something, that's the wrong word, I'm offended, I need to sue you, you're my enemy. So in general, yes, and that's again something that I try to do myself on a college campus, saying, just be generous for 1 second. Also narrow the scope of who is your enemy. You're allowed to really disagree and even maybe be extremely angry at certain groups. But 60 million? That's a lot. Can we narrow the range of the people that we see as them in the us versus them thing? That would be a start.
All right. Well, I love your optimism. Amy, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Amy Chua. Make sure you watch part 1 of our 2-part series as well. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.